I think we will go ahead and get started. Thanks again, everybody, for sharing some time today. Super excited to have everyone. I know it's a busy time of year for many, and a hectic time in the world for most. So, just want to say that we appreciate you, prioritizing some time with us today. I'm super excited to get to share the hour with a couple amazing colleagues and friends, Dr. Leah Baker and Dr. Tino Diaz. I'm going to do a quick intro about the book and about the Pathways framework, and then pass most of the time over to them to share and talk. And certainly looking forward to engaging sessions. So we've got the chat open, and you all have the opportunity if you'd like to unmute and engage directly. So um, just want to kick us off first with, in case this is anyone's first Campus Compact webinar, if it is, welcome. If not, this is probably old news for you, but Campus Compact envisions a world in which all of higher education commits to advancing equitable, accessible, and just democracy, where colleges and universities serve as responsive and transformative agents of change, with students, faculty, staff, and administrators joining as true partners with communities in contributing to our collective flourishing. Campus Compact's mission is to support, engage, and challenge higher education to realize its public purpose. So I'm going to do just a very quick introduction to the Pathways framework. And certainly, if you'd like, there are multiple webinars from this series that you can go back and get a little bit more in depth into the history of the Pathways framework, and into some of the other components of the book. But just as a level setting, the Pathways framework, excuse me, was developed primarily as an advising tool for students to think about how they want to affect change in their communities, how they want to make a difference in the issues that they care most about. And so you might hear them described as the pathways of public service and civic engagement. That was sort of the original name, but then also many institutions take a different formation of the name. For example, at UVU's Pathways of Social Impact, or Pathways of Community Engagement at another institution. And so that pathways language at the beginning is the common feature. We do ask that in using the framework, that the language of each of the pathways doesn't get altered, because one of the benefits that we found in using this is shared language across the field, and an opportunity for some more collaboration across the field and across institutions. So this is the Pathways framework: community engaged learning and research, direct service, policy and governance, community organizing and activism, philanthropy, and social entrepreneurship, and corporate social responsibility. The book that was published last fall was a multi-year project. Two of our amazing authors, as I mentioned, are with us today. The webinar series has focused in on different of the sections of the book. So we had practitioner profiles, which is meant to really enhance and kind of build a little bit more foundational knowledge and skills and attributes within each of the pathways. Enhancing learning tools or lining up with learning outcomes, really giving students more of an opportunity to how they see themselves in the pathways framework. And then the current uses section in the book was a series of more or less case studies, a look at how different institutions are using the Pathways framework. This can be in large and small ways, really institutional efforts and specific programs that are unpacked in the Pathways framework. And then our session today is two chapters from the theoretical, empirical, and critical reflection section. So broad section that you're going to get to hear more about. I always like to, any chance I get to talk about the book, lift up all of the authors who helped contribute to the book. I always say this is probably my favorite slide in the deck, just getting to see all the amazing people that made the book possible. I think I saw a couple names on here in the attendees, so maybe we'll hear from you a little bit later. And now I am going to pass the time over to Dr. Baker to set up her chapter.
Okay, good day, good people. Welcome. I'm incredibly excited to engage with you all today. I am always grateful to be in spaces with Sean Crossland. Incredibly excited to engage with fellow author Tino. Grateful for that introduction as well and of the project, Sean, especially considering the mission of why we're here today and how Campus Compact is sort of hosting the series. So I'll share just a little bit about me and then kind of dig right into what this chapter was about and hope to really do some dialogue. I focused mostly on what we could possibly talk about. So I don't have a lot of slides per se. I pulled a couple of nuggets from the chapter that I contributed, hoping to really pull from all of the wonderful thinkers in this audience in the ways that we can spark conversation, in the ways that we all come together through our work. I think first and foremost, I'm a faculty member at the University of Dayton in the School of Education and Health Sciences, where I pursue research, teaching, and scholarship in communities of place and practice. I'm also affiliated with the Human Rights Center here at the University of Dayton, and I'm also a current faculty fellow with the University of Dayton Fitz Center for Leadership in the Community. And I would love to know who's in this Zoom space, if I may, just kind of by like a show of a burst of emojis, if you will. If you're a student in this space, go ahead and use maybe a red heart or a red emoji to represent who you are. Um, awesome. If you're like a longtime learner or forever student, right? Always a red heart for me. If you're an administrator, if you consider yourself, needing to do a lot of the administration stuff from your day-to-day in your day-to-day work, use a purple heart. You can put it in the chat or you can put it in your Zoom little Hollywood square. If you are a higher ed faculty or staff, use a yellow heart. If you're a community-based participant or community-based organizer or something of the like, use a green heart, right? A lot of us have crossover. We hold multiple hats. If you're anything else that I haven't mentioned, use a blue heart. And then go ahead and with that blue heart, feel free to put in the chat who you are, what you're representing, what space or place, community or place you are bringing in with you today, so we know who's in the Zoom room. And I think this again will be very fitting with the ways in which I hope maybe we've envisioned this being sort of a dialogue. Um, I think that there are also opportunities for us to think about the ways that we sort of bring in our values and our culture, right? And so a lot of the ways that I come to the spaces that I tend to be invited into is to try to share a little bit about myself to kick off the sort of like the sense of cultural belonging. And so I was born in Alabama, and then I was raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so I have these, two places that I call home. And so I tend to value things like Southern hospitality and like hard work ethic. Having these two really unique internal values systems, internal places. And so I also invite you in the Zoom space to put in maybe where you're from and an internal value that you bring with you into this space, by way of sharing, representing your community building, the placeholders or the things that reflect your values throughout the time that you've spent in the places that you've been. I also see, a lot of resembling of values of kindness and empathy and integrity, right? Human dignity in the ways that we have represented the titles that we hold in the spaces that we belong to. So even in the professional roles that we carry with us, what are those values? What are those ways that we're kind of centering those values in our missions, in our community engaged work, or in our higher ed work? Love it. I see beautiful places being represented, the importance of place in history, community engagements, research, you name it. So bring with that, bring with us that kind of sense or sentiment of thinking as we think about this really interesting challenge of naming the mission of creating opportunities to dialogue, around public or higher education in the sense of the public good, or naming the purpose of higher education in the sense of where we are today. And I hope to talk a little bit about that as it connects to where I began, where I started to sort of play with this ideas as represented in this trajectory of thoughtful concepts, if you will, that sort of dance behind the scenes in the chapter that I contributed. So please feel free to continue to share, add thoughts, add questions, add comments in the chat. I hope to engage really richly as sort of, within the sense of reciprocity. I personally don't believe in expert thinking, expert knowledge, as much as I believe in community engaged teaching and learning. So my research employs critical and postmodern social theories. And in this chapter, I explored possibilities for examining individual and group identity in relation to civic identity in a racialized society. I then offered suggestions for integrating theoretical and interpretive frameworks of critical consciousness in ways that invite a deeper analysis of race and racism, and center strategies to develop a stronger lens for racial and social justice, given the moment that we were in, given the criticality of the times. So, sort of backwards mapping. A few years ago, I had this really wonderful opportunity to work with really wonderful people as part of the Pathways Working Group to pursue deeper questions and thought experiments using the Pathways framework to explore specific examples of what it would look like in practice to shift critical consciousness in my own way of teaching and research and scholarship and civic identity development, but more geared towards the population I was sort of serving in higher ed, which was a doctoral group. So we were looking at literally utilizing our constructs of research to do actual change in organizations, to look at that through a lens of service, and speak directly to what that would mean with regard for a vision for change. And so the Pathways tool, if you will, the Pathways framework became this really wonderful way for a really curious and courageous scholar like me to say, hey, I want to play around with this. And there was this group of people who said, yeah, come along and play with us, play with the ways in which we are trying to deeply understand how we can do more good. As such, the culminating chapter explored the integration of critical consciousness and social justice frameworks into civic identity development and community engagement in higher ed. So the chapter emphasized the importance of integrating critical consciousness and social justice into civic identity development within higher ed to address systemic oppression and promote social change. So I had a chance to play with the Pathways tool as it related to the definitions and the parameters of service as we were, operating in our limits, the limitations to what we were experiencing as a nation state, as a national consciousness, with our history of racism, with our history of sexism. And through the exploration, I pondered if developing civic identity actually risks reinforcing oppression if it's not paired with explicitly addressing those societal systemic issues on point, right? There were several challenges and opportunities that were present. One, current civic engagement approaches, as we know them through higher ed centers, group development, teaching and learning strategies, you name it, they tend to sort of become inundated with some of the current sociocultural structures of higher ed, and that almost inadvertently can exacerbate inequalities if social justice is not central to the mission. So, two, there's a need to reimagine civic engagement, emphasizing both individual and collective agency. Well, what does that mean? What do we mean by that? Critical consciousness then inspired by Paulo Freire, is essential for understanding and challenging systemic injustices. And in order to achieve that, civic identity should include this sort of really central reflection on the social constructions of racism, sexism, and ableism at the core of any kind of action and interaction that would then consequently lead to any kind of development in civic engagement, civic identity opportunities for students that would ultimately be informed by a collective consciousness that would lead us to a more robust way of thinking about what we're doing, how we're doing civic engagement, how we're doing civic identity development in higher ed, because higher ed is primed for ethical reflection and intellectual rigor in addressing social injustices, particularly faced by communities of color, if we can center those conversations in a way that doesn't necessarily shy away from the surface level tensions of having the conversations. And so I think there are a lot of things that are happening all at once that maybe requires us to do multiple things by way of also at the same time centering just a few things. And so maybe if we go to the next slide, I think that just the few things gets sort of kind of couched within the notion of critical theory. And so critical theory helps to underpin the importance of critical consciousness in education. And it's been this way to help us further deconstruct the ideologies that sort of circulate and circumvent a lot of the things, the practices and the policies that we see consistently getting in the way of real change. And so a lot of the ways in which we can start to also witness stronger impact or greater impact, particularly as it connects to some of our larger goals, our larger hopes with regard for focusing on empowering individuals to develop sort of this collective identity or collective um, um, agency for larger social constructs that seem like wicked problems, is to really focus on empowering critical thought and exposing those ideological barriers at the onset of our civic identity practices. Increasing awareness of personal agency, first and foremost, is part and parcel to disrupting injustice. We see this happening in really beautiful spaces in higher ed, in courses that we love, the courses that we say, wow, I've never even thought about things like that before. So how can we be better at bringing those things together, understanding that history is necessary for understanding and unpacking or contextualizing why it's important to challenge and then frame the opportunities in civic identity development. Understanding the historical context guides future or further anti-oppression actions, right? Recognizing that perception of reality as a form of possession is also a very Freudian pedagogy as well. And so embedded in this notion of thinking about real world problems, wicked problems, is also a really wonderful opportunity, right? Challenges and directions for the field, opportunities for community engaged scholars to bridge theory and practice, to look at the ways that we are already doing some of the work in the community, in the field, that really taps into our critical consciousness by way of exposing or exploring social injustices within social systems that can then sort of transform or be transformative in the ways that becomes sort of the model, really, the partnership, the institutional practice in which we are now thinking more about the centrality of higher ed as the mission, as the goal of a critical consciousness for civic identity. One more slide, and then maybe I'm going to start wrapping up because I really want to hear from others and hear from Tino as well. So I think just having opportunities to use something like a pathways survey or a pathways tool to to initiate the conversation and have students just start to unpack or deconstruct the learned realities, right? The lived experiences that lead to the narratives that need to be shared, lives also in the world of critical theory, but helps us sort of nuance the ways in which critical reflection then helps to analyze power, privilege, and social issues embedded in the service that we provide. Particularly in the work of faculty, right? Particularly in the work of community engaged centers. We are positioning ourselves to impact society, but asking the question first and foremost, the impact of society and education on civic engagement has already started from a really unique societal and historical place, and asking ourselves or going back and asking about the influence of that societal and historical place on civic participation is perhaps one place we can start to think about how that then precedes either our perception of or lack of perception of our agency in doing something different, which then leads us to a different reality or a different awareness of our civic identity. And I think I'll just kind of wrap up here. I don't know how close I am to the 20-ish minutes, or, but I would love to hear some thoughts and maybe be able to like engage in the chat too. I think what happens here is the opportunity to bring a lot of different conversations together. Civic identity development must include a focus on systemic social issues, because without it, we run the risk of a legacy of things like racism remaining a major challenge in higher ed, and initiatives that should focus on things like anti-racism, for example, to promote civic identity, don't necessarily get interwoven as key civic or collective responsibilities, where we're sharing the same language, where we're actually able to make sense of how we nurture or strengthen our collective civic identity to strengthen a democracy. And it doesn't necessarily matter, I don't think, where we stand per se. I think when we start with something like values, when we start there and we start at the core of understanding the mission of higher ed, systems should be universalized to reduce inequality. And in that way of understanding the mission or the purpose of an organization, of an institution, I think we can all hang our hats on that as a value system. Therein lies the work, the civic work, and the civic work must be rooted then in a commitment to that idea of social justice. And so I think what I was hoping to do, what I think maybe comes through in this chapter, which was a great way to offer an integration of what has happened before in previous chapters, is this deeper analysis of the fact that we have not overcome, that race and racism, in the analysis of race and racism, hasn't yet been something that we have been able to tackle, right? As a wicked problem. And so in order to use something that has such success in the ways of creating or providing foundational knowledge for lots of students in a very, accessible way, might also be a way to strengthen our ability to develop a stronger lens for practitioner scholarship engagement. This is where I think these are the moments where you have lots of different angles, lenses, perspectives, ideologies coming together that will create opportunities that include tracing roots of oppression, bringing cultures together, and listening empathetically to provide transformative resistance, and which is essential for exposing and undoing some of those social injustices. And so I think it becomes more practical. It's the practical application of something that we can use, like using a tool in educational settings or systems like higher ed, to promote more critical consciousness or more critical reflection, where we haven't necessarily been able to wrap our heads around the how. How do we do that? And I think this was one of those moments where I was just given a little bit of time and a little bit of camaraderie to say, yeah, why don't you play with that idea? So I'm gonna stop talking there, and I would love to either entertain some really healthy, helpful thoughts around this, some other ways that people have done this, and very importantly, the way that Tino, my fellow author here, has also thought about this in this really important way of thinking about the theoretical and philosophical conceptions of what we mean when we say directions for this field. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Yeah, John. John, go ahead. Good to see you.
Great, thank you. Uh, Aaliyah, I loved every word you said.
Hi, John.
I would love to have a week to just sit with you and unpack what this looks like in practice. Uh, but I'll limit myself to one question right now. Um, you talked about using critical reflection to help students analyze social structures of power and privilege. And I wonder if you could give us maybe just one or two really concrete examples of a day in the classroom where you did that.
I would love to. Absolutely. So I did this really interesting diagram in the chapter, and then I named it something like, and it's not a great name for it, but I named it something like a visual teaching model for developing a theory of service for social justice, right? So a day in the life of what that looks like. First and foremost, I think it is centering the narratives, right? Centering those experiences. So one of the things that we have been doing very intentionally, I think, in um, in cultural studies and work that really tries to decolonize epistemologies and practice critical methodologies, is to center stories or storytelling, counter storytelling, to deconstruct notions of identity and power. And so, one practice is to use the stories that are being told, the collective experiences, to challenge privileged perspectives. What does that look like? There are lots of different ways. Maybe there's no canon. I don't even use the term canon, but I digress, right? Maybe there are moments where the textbook becomes the recognition of the importance of experiential knowledge, but right, um, that there are opportunities to think about what we mean when we say something like disaster capitalism. And now we are practicing all of the ways, we are deconstructing all of the ways that we can undo how we are participating in that particular practice. There are just a number of ways that you sit and you think about what it means, asking the question, what do we mean when we say? And especially from marginalized community perspectives. And so I think that's one way to do it, and maybe multiple ways that I just mentioned. And two, just starting with our values, starting very similar to how we started today, inviting our full authentic selves into the spaces that we belong to. And that's not just a blanket statement. That's me being who I am every single place that I go, and having the courage to do that. And knowing that there are people who cannot do that and will not do that. And what does that look like to continue to empower people to feel as though they can be their full authentic selves, and
Mhm.
be able to suspend judgment of others' experiences, right? Just a couple of ideas. I think we could come up with quite a few, though, had we had more time, had we had that week.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
Wonder if I could also ask a question and share a thought. Awesome. Oh yeah, great job. Super impressed. And a lot of it ties into some of the work that I've been exploring, even internally, right? I've had
you.
this like interesting path more towards like civic engagement and how do we critique, but also build on these structures that currently reside in higher education. Um, I'm working with like, and this is like a separate project of mine. I don't even want to say project, but like a thing we're doing in our community here in Utah County, which is like a really different space compared to like Salt Lake, the Salt Lake County in Utah. Two very different geo-political spaces, if you think about it. Um, and I love to understand this idea more of like critical conscious building, identity, and I'm working with a class of youth in high school, mostly Latina based. You know, like they are from Latin America. Their ancestries from Latin America, and navigating, I think, K through 12 policy and practices, and trying to somehow create and entertain critical conscious building is like a really funny, messy business, I think, in some ways. And so you've given me some thoughts around how the pathways can be implemented. And I'd love to know your thoughts around what does this mean potentially when it comes to youth, working with youth in that regard? Like you've had a lot of work with like college students and also like grad, level efforts. Like, what does this feel like when it comes to working with youth, and um, how does that look like to you, I guess, in some ways? Yeah, I'm just really curious.
I love that question, Tino. I appreciate that very much. Yeah, I'll share a little bit. I'll share a personal story. So I started my career in K-12 education. And so that became sort of the impetus for where I am today. And I never forget the faces of the students who I had in the classroom. That is really what propels me into the ways that I feel responsibility to, speak truth to power, right? And so, I remember thinking about all of the ways that there was such um, difficulty in witnessing some of the bureaucracy that exists in K-12 education, and then feeling incredible, um, for lack of a better term, um, inability to be able to transcend some of that while also being incredibly empathic and creating an ethic of care and being incredibly attentive to all the little beings, right, in who are in front of you, who are looking to you for hope and change and love and just sheer love, right, love as praxis in the classroom. And so one of the things I hope that we can do in the sense of K-12 education is start to think about our practices and our policies and think about them in the way that one of my beloved scholars talks about, in the sense of understanding this idea of proximity to pain, right? So a lot of times, Dr. Jeffrey Duncan Andrade does work around, equity issues in school systems. And a lot of times what happens is we have people who are well-intended, right? People who are in school boards and school districts who are making decisions with well intention, but they're really far removed from the realities that exist in those faces and those in those homes of the students. Um, if we are designing practices and policies that resemble ideologies that are incredibly distant from the proximity to the realities, right? Proximity to pain. We are doing an injustice, right? Um, we're perhaps not necessarily understanding or helping students understand the root of systemic inequalities. There has to be a moment where we can perhaps think about the policy or the practice that we're using, such as a grading scale, and think about where we may be doing things just by way of doing them that doesn't necessarily need to happen anymore. Where can we say, why do we need to do this anymore? To whose benefit and at what cost? And I think this came up, if I can borrow from an example that was not too long ago, but feels like like a decade ago. During the pandemic, a lot of school boards and school districts are really struggling with this idea of an all A grading policy. There was a moment where it didn't make any sense to grade children, grade students, by way of knowing that there were incredible inequities that existed across homes, across communities, across geographic locations. How do you assess a child who doesn't have the same thing at home that they had at school? How do you assess on on a level playing field, even if they are not equipped with equality, right? And there were heated debates around this idea of an all A grading policy. And I think at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, who cares? Who cares about the A at the end of the day if we're really not solving the systemic inequality? The problem is not the student. The problem is the fact that we are giving something, that we're using a system that has been riddled in systemic inequality. It doesn't make sense anymore. And so I think those are the challenges that we have to face. I think that's where something like just sit down and have a conversation. Just ask ourselves, what are we doing? And then maybe a pathways tool can help with that, right? But I digress.
No, I would argue that was powerful. Thank you. You're giving me like a lot of thoughts. So I'm gonna have to like reflect on this and like journal later. But yeah, very much very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Wonderful. Thanks, Aaliyah. Yeah, obviously we could spend, as John said, a week. So we are going to shift now. Tino, if you want to take us to the top of the hour.
Sure. Sounds good. Let's see the host spotlight. Okay. Sounds good. All right. Man, I just want to keep talking with Aaliyah and just get some more thoughts. And but another time we'll have to connect. Um, well, thank you everybody. My name is Agustin Diaz, but I just go by Tino. And originally from Brooklyn, New York, but I came to Utah and I don't know how. It just happened and I've been kidnapped and I'm never leaving again for some reason. And so something I'll have to unpack in the future. But I've been here for some time, have a family here, co-parent here, and most importantly, I help organize here locally where I'm at. And I want to give folks an idea of where exactly we live, where I live. So you have the state of Utah, which typically has a certain political context that most folks just think as surface value is very like red, conservative, hard right, etc. But when you dive into Utah, you'll find actually a very nuanced picture, like most geographies. And you'll have Salt Lake, which is in some ways a bastion of like liberal ideology and progressive politics. And then you have a place up north, some more like the Davis and Weber counties, which have their own little cities and their own problems too. And then south of Salt Lake, which is Utah County, where I live, and is home to several big higher education institutions. Also, a place where the religious ideology known as the Latter-day Saint, the Mormon or the Latter-day Saint Church, is pretty heavily based. And so you have that in the discourse of the place. But at the same time, you have a really interesting thing happening where folks are talking to each other from all sides of the political spectrum in some ways. That's not so binary. I mean, people are talking about issues together, and it's really fascinating, especially when you have the explosion, and I say explosion quite literally, of minoritized communities just everywhere across the state. And that obviously challenges certain things. And I say that in the context of like where I live, but also of you know, oftentimes there's like this narrative from the Salt Lake side that's like Utah County is so white, Utah County is so conservative, Utah County is so backwards, blah blah blah. But that's not the case. My children's schools are predominantly black and brown children, in a place like Utah County, right? Which changes the narrative, and they're public schools, and so that demographic shift is happening too. And I say that to kind of place where I was at here when this situation occurred at Utah Valley University some years ago. And I'm gonna mention some really heavy topics, so I'm just calling that out right now about a child taking their own life and some of that dynamics in there. And I'm getting emotional. I'm sorry. It was a really it was a very powerful and also tragic time in our lives. And just even rereading the chapter, Sean, rereading that chapter like got to me on the train ride this morning. It was really, really difficult, but also beautiful. And so shout out to the people I worked with, Bree and Priscilla and so many others who did such powerful things to help this go on. But in that time frame, Izzy Tishner, who lived north of Salt Lake in that area I was talking about previously, took her life, and that set off a number of alarm bells and issues across the state that this would happen, especially when reporting and issues were going on in that school district that nobody was noticing or nobody was understanding of what was going on. And it just went unreported and undiagnosed. And at the same time, this horrible thing happened. And so as this was going on, as the family was battling in court, was also dealing with a number of issues, we came to find out what was going on. And typically, and I worked as a program manager in the Center for Social Impact at Utah Valley University at the time. Me, Bree, and Priscilla, Brianna, or Brianna, who were student leaders in that center, decided to organize and do something specifically for Izzy and to motivate people in our community about what was happening and actually help engagement in that area. And we met with Izzy's family. We met with our local Black Lives Matter Utah chapter. And it was a pretty powerful experience to meet with Izzy's family and do this together and talk with Izzy's family about them wanting to have the word spread, especially as we met with the legal team to say, hey, doing this helps create momentum, helps create buy-in from the community, from various communities, that this needs to like be addressed. And so it was a powerful moment that we had, and I'm really proud of the work we did. I'm really proud of the work we did. I'm really proud of the family, and it was probably one of the best moments of my life in terms of walking away from higher education at the time, which I did, knowing that we created long-lasting community impact. And I'm sorry I'm getting emotional, but that's just who I am. I'm just throwing that out there. Um, and so. Now I've given you the idea of like where the scenario actually happened and what we did and how we did it. And I want to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from and so forth. So I've worked in a number of higher ed roles in the state of Utah in various offices from financial aid, admissions, all kinds across the spectrum of student affairs in different institutions. And there was a point, and that's after this event that we had for Izzy's community event, that I decided to leave higher ed and search for opportunities outside because it felt like a really good point where I just said, this work has been good. We've done really good work, and I just want to see what else is out there. And I did that. And then I came back in terms of teaching adjunct and pursuing my doctorate and doing some of that work. Some of the research that have dug myself into, if anything, has been ethnic studies, learning design, memory and cognition, decolonial and indigenous epistemologies, along with critical university studies. And something as of late that I've been exploring more has been civic engagement and even constitutional studies in higher education, how that's fleshed out, which in many times, and Aaliyah mentioned this, has really problematic poses in higher education on who it centers and why, especially areas like constitutional studies. Um, and so that's where I'm coming from, but also more than that, I've been an organizer in the community with migrant rights, labor rights, and something that I'm doing more recent, and I want to dive into it a little bit later, is the ideas of community building along Octavia Butler's books of Parable of the Sower and Talent. This idea that relationships matters so much, especially in when we think might be the end of times, you know? So I want to set the stage there. And Sean, if we go on to the next slide, please. Now, some of the work we've actually built in place, Brianna, Priscilla, and I, in our discussions were, okay, what happened and why did we think of it this way and how can we speak towards it? So we utilized the framework of refusal to speak to what we did and why, and how we departed from institutional programming, didn't actually make a case for like this will receive this kind of program outcome, this will have this kind of event metric, and etc. And really did it out of the heart of organizing and to refuse what we oftentimes think of as colonial capitalist structures within higher education that are obviously from the point of implicit within higher education. And that's something we like are obviously at tension with. We have some really beautiful experiences in higher education, but we also have some really terrible outcomes too as a result of that. And that's a tension we try to navigate in the piece as well. Um, and so I want to point out some of these scholars here who I consider scholars around refusal and decolonial work around this area. First and foremost, Grandy Sande, who wrote a piece called "Refusing the University," and that's a pretty important and critical piece in this work. And she outlines 3 points that I think are just equally important: collectivity, mutuality, and reciprocity that are refusing or practices of refusing in this way, in terms of building relationships outside of institutions, but also um, generating practices outside but within institutions and keeping the community in mind. And that's pretty powerful. Roderick Ferguson, just right below, is an incredible scholar on critical inclusion, critical DEI, talks a lot about, problematizes the idea of belonging and understands how can students, educators, and staff refuse this idea of belonging to an institution, but also more to each other, if anything. And I think that's a pretty powerful notion. Glenn Coulthard on the top is an Indigenous scholar from First Nations up north and also talks a lot about this idea of sovereignty and not belonging to institutions and belonging to oneself and building community as a result of that. And Leanne Simpson, right below, another Indigenous scholar around refusal and how it's not just a political stance, it's also an ontological stance. It's a state of being that one must embrace and actually carry forward. So those are some of the scholars that helped inform this work, and I just want to make a note of them and their incredible endeavors and so forth. So Sean, we can go on to the next slide. And so this was just I wanted to make a note of this. We met with Izzy's family, we organized the event, we departed from our programming as a center, and we really did extra work. We did a lot more work from our additional programming and events and anything like that to build this and to build this in relationship with community. The news came. We didn't invite the news, but they came. And the legal team with Izzy and her family mentioned like this actually was a really timely push when they were in court and it got socialized by media on what was going on and why. And so it was like an additional push to help them win their case and get policy in place for protections for students in the future. So again, super proud for some of the work done by the students, but also proud and honored to have worked with Izzy's family around these things. Sean, I'll have us go to the next slide. Um, And so, how does refusal apply in this situation? Again, we wanted to position this as a way to see how we, in many ways, refused this idea of we had to operate a program by institutional standards. We had to somehow measure the outcome of an institute of this event of this practice. We had to somehow programatize this into some kind of thing as part of our efforts into some progressive and liberal feature. But really, what it came down to is grinding down into our relationships, owning them, and building within them. And so, if anything, refusal is not just a critique towards institutions and their ability to institutionalize and co-op programs and co-op, knowledge bases and things like that, but it's a relational praxis that we can build with one another, to grow with one another, and to actually create awareness around for each other. And so that's where a lot of the work is coming from. And this many, many years later, as time has passed, and if I sat down with these ideas and have sat down with Bree and Priscilla and talked about this and revisited this, um, we think about the relationships built that day, but also the material help that we were able to give to Izzy's family in terms of monetary funds to support their case, but also just creating awareness around the issue and how, in some ways, we didn't intend on the pathways being involved, but they showed up and they showed up in numerous ways. And it's not like we said, hey, okay, this program will have this outcome and in this characteristic will build this feature and so on and so on. But they showed up in numerous ways organically, and we were very open to that, right? It's almost, and this might be complex to say, it's messy, but it's using institutional resources. It's using Western methodologies, it's using all these practices that sometimes come from very problematic places within the space of university education and Western liberal ideology, but using them for our own purposes when it comes to community impact and helping people get across to where they want to go. And so that for me was very much reinforced in this regard. And as far as now, again, reflecting on what's happened and how we can look at it from this point, again, using the tools was a very material way to seek impact in our community. And even Aaliyah's points about, how she was able to use the pathways in this way was kind of like a reminder that we can use these things for certain measures and get them going, for lack of a better term. And a question or thoughts and questions I keep having in myself like are, as time has progressed, we've also lost touch with the family. That's something we're just willing to own. We've lost touch with the family. Utah Black Lives Matter has changed as well. Time has passed and things have moved forward in other ways that we didn't consider. Um, and so I also wonder, what does that mean about our relationships long term when there's no strategy in place, but we still seek to hope and create change. And that's more of a question for myself, a reflective question than anything. And then along with the idea of like, can refusal actually have impact in higher education? What does it mean to just refuse practices and knowledge bases and do something else and do something different? And also, what does that mean for student, educator, and community member relationality, or that alliance that I think is critical to transforming the conditions of our society? And so I'll end on that note. I don't want to take too much time. We're almost at time. Um, but I want to thank Sean and Aaliyah for having the space open. I want to thank Sean for putting me on this as well to reread the chapter because it was a powerful reading, man. And I'm just grateful to have been reminded of like, wow, we did that and that happened. And we built some really great relationships out of that. And we shouldn't forget that, you know? So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tino. Yeah, great to get to revisit this and yeah, absolutely to hear your reflections with some space in between and the significance of them. So um We have just a couple minutes. So I want to do one thing quickly while I open up the opportunity for anybody to share a quick reflection, a question, a comment, a follow-up. And as I'm doing that, I'm just going to put a link in the chat if folks are interested in digging deeper into the Pathways working group. You can find the details on that link. You can also find a demo of the Pathways survey. And of course, if you haven't gotten a copy of the book yet, hopefully this is a good inspiration for you to do so. The chapters are we got 20 minutes each of chapters that had months and months and months of work into them. So definitely didn't get to cover all of the thoughtful, significant details in each of those chapters. So yeah, with a minute or two left, does anybody have a question, comment, reaction that they'd like to share before we all part ways? I think you both left them speechless. I think that's what just happened.
I actually do have a question for Dino, but I don't want to, if there are others who have questions, I would, reserve um, that space for them.
No,
I,
please do.
I am first and foremost, may Izzy's soul rest in peace, and her spirit live on. I'm curious about your connection to organizing and the ways that we've perhaps understood organizing and resistance, perhaps maybe transformational resistance or transformative resistance, and how you're using refusal now in your work, and what if there's any way that you would offer those of us who are seeking stronger ways to help surface the rhetoric of demonstration around refusal, around resistance. How can we nuance that more? Yeah, if that's it's a mixed up question right now because I'm so moved by the ways that those things come together.
Yeah, thank you. We'll have to have a coffee chat one day as well
We
to dig
do.
in
We
more.
will.
Yeah. But like my initial thought is like I think traditional conceptions around resistance and even movements have been, like ideas that are pretty much solidified around policy change and voting access and institutional transformation, right? Which I think are obviously important, right? These things have material impact in our communities, and I think that's important. But I think refusal has opened up, and I think that's what I wanted to say that I might not have said, is that refusal has opened up new ways in which we can change not just ourselves, but with like our relationships to each other, right? Sandy Grande talks a lot about collectivity, reciprocity, and mutuality. Reciprocity being this idea of like when you create knowledge, it doesn't always have to be through academia. Like it's something that you can actually share and expand amongst your community and with each other. Mutuality, this idea that we don't have to just organize ourselves by societal divisions or I think that's an important we have a Latina-based group that I work with migrant rights, but we have other groups that we are like very issues based around labor that we bring in multiple groups around that. And that one is a really important one too because we're all a bunch of Marxists and I'll own that and that's okay. But it's but we're all like coming from different spaces and that's part of coalition building, right? And so I think that's that group that I mentioned that I work with, we have about to like 5 families in Utah County that we've created this like little community network, emergency plans, weapons training, like things like that are real. Like we are looking to craft a different vision for our future for each other. And that means like oftentimes dipping outside the institution to build these things. And it's not something we should be afraid of, I think, or shun, but maybe engage if we have capacity and time. But that's just my thoughts around that. That's also probably oversimplifying as well. In cases, yeah. Like, hey, if you have time, just go and do things. Which you don't, yeah. But it's challenged us and it's moved us to try things out. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Awesome. Well, let me just end by saying thank you both again so very much. I think we, obviously could have spent hours on each of these topics, and fun to get to see a little bit of overlap and exploring each other's ideas. And yeah, thanks again. And we'll see you all soon. Both of you take care. I'll be in touch.
Take care.
Okay.